Millionaire catches her husband. Humiliating a single dad gardener. What she did, no one expected. Just before we begin, your presence means a lot. Say hi and share where you're tuning in from, only if you want to. The morning Michael Harmon pulled his truck through the iron gates of the Callaway estate. The sky was still purple at the edges, the kind of dark that belongs only to men who start work before the world wakes up. He had driven 40 minutes from the east side of Maplewood, past the gas stations and the bodegas, and the apartment complex where the parking lot light had been broken for 6 weeks. Past the elementary school where his daughter Avery would walk through the front door in 3 hours. Past the diner where he sometimes bought her a blueberry muffin when the week had been especially hard. He knew every turn of that drive-by feel now. He could do it half asleep. Some mornings he did. He parked his truck at the service entrance the way he always did. No fuss, no hesitation. Just the quiet habit of a man who understood exactly where he stood in the geometry of a place like this. The Callaway property was 11 acres of curated beauty. Rolling lawn, sculpted hedges, a koi pond with a Japanese maple arching over it like a red question mark. Flower beds arranged with the kind of precision that most people assumed was natural, but was actually the result of Michael's 4 hours of work every Tuesday and Thursday morning, before the household staff was even fully caffeinated. He climbed out of the truck and pulled on his work gloves the way soldiers pull on their gear. Methodical. No wasted motion. He had a system for everything, and the system was what kept him sane. The gloves, then the knee pads clipped to his belt, then the small leather notebook where he tracked every plant's condition, its water schedule, the subtle changes in soil pH he monitored with the kind of attentiveness that most people reserved for things they loved. For Michael, the plants were not just plants, they were his craft. They were the one place in his life where his full intelligence was allowed to speak without being interrupted. Avery was still asleep when he had left the apartment that morning. He always checked on her before he walked out the door. Always stood in the dim hallway outside her bedroom and watched the small rise and fall of her chest through the crack in the door. She slept with her mouth slightly open, one arm thrown over a stuffed rabbit named Carrots that had seen better days. The rabbit was missing one eye and its left ear had been sewn back on twice by Michael. Using a sewing kit he'd bought at a dollar store and a YouTube tutorial he'd watched at midnight. He was not a man who had ever considered himself domestic. But fatherhood has a way of expanding a man's skill set whether he asks for it or not. He had arranged everything before he left. Her clothes were laid out on the chair by her bed, the blue jeans and the yellow shirt with the small sunflower on the pocket that she called her lucky shirt. Her lunch was packed in the refrigerator, peanut butter and strawberry jam with no crusts, apple slices in a small container, a juice box, and a handwritten note folded into a square that she always unfolded at the lunch table and read with the serious face of a child receiving important correspondence. He had written the note in the dark at 5:15 in the morning using the flashlight on his phone so he wouldn't wake her. It said, "You are the bravest person I know. Have a good day, bug. Love, Dad." This was the invisible architecture of Michael Harmon's life. The parts no one ever saw. The planning that happened in the margins of sleep. The calculations he ran in his head between tasks. Whether there was enough money in the account to cover Avery's school field trip next week. Whether the slow leak in the apartment kitchen faucet was going to turn into something more expensive before he could get to it. Whether her cough 2 nights ago was just dry winter air or something that needed a doctor's visit. A single father's mind is never fully quiet. It runs on 2 tracks simultaneously, always. The work in front of him, and the child at the center of everything else. He had been doing this for 4 years. Since Elena. Since the accident on the interstate that had taken her on a Thursday evening in November, while Michael was in the middle of a client presentation 2 states away, his phone buzzing silently in his briefcase. He did not think about that evening in the ordered way that grief counselors suggested. He did not journal about it or talk about it in the support group his doctor had once gently recommended. He carried it the way old working men carry bad knees, aren't aware of it always. Adjusting for it without complaint, never giving it more room than it absolutely required. What he had done instead was simplify. He had taken the job with Verdana Landscaping 14 months after the accident, when it became clear that the consulting firm in Chicago, the career he had spent a decade building, the career that had put his name on projects across 4 continents, was not compatible with being the only parent of a 7-year-old who sometimes woke up from nightmares at 2 in the morning asking for her mother. Some sacrifices are made out of weakness. This one was made out of love so complete it left no room for ambivalence. He had folded his old life quietly, the way you fold a map when you've reached your destination and no longer need it, and he had driven to Maplewood, rented the apartment with the sage green walls he would later paint himself, enrolled Avery in the school 6 blocks away, and gone to work. He was on his knees beside the east rose bed, carefully deadheading the spent blooms and checking the soil near the base of a climbing Cecile Brunner that had been showing signs of aphid pressure, when he heard the voice for the first time that day. William Calloway's voice was the kind of voice that had never been told no often enough. It had that particular texture, smooth on top, contemptuous underneath, of a man who had always occupied the top floor and had mistaken that position for a quality of character. "Is that him?" William said, not to Michael, but to the 2 men walking beside him. Business associates of some kind. The landscaping company had been asked to make the property presentable for a meeting that morning. Both men wore expensive shoes that were entirely wrong for the damp grass and did not seem aware of this. "Michael, is it? The gardener?" Michael looked up from the rose bed. "Yes, sir. Michael Harmon. I'll be out of your way shortly. I'm nearly done with the east section." "Take your time," William said, which was not generosity. It was the tone of a man performing patience in front of an audience. He turned to his associates. "My wife insists on using this particular service. Sentimental, I suppose. She likes the, what do you call it, the personal touch." He made a small gesture with his hand, a gesture that encompassed Michael. The truck at the service entrance, the work gloves, the kneeling position, everything about the scene that William Calloway found decorative in its subservience. One of the associates glanced at Michael with mild curiosity, the way a person glances at functional infrastructure. The other did not look at all. Michael said nothing. He turned back to the roses and continued his work with the same steady, unhurried attention he always brought to it. He had learned, in the years since the accident, that silence was not weakness. Silence was the thing that preserved what was real inside him from the erosion of other people's smallness. What happened next was the kind of thing that starts small and then does not stay small. William Calloway's phone rang, and he answered it, and while he was talking he began pacing the path that ran along the east bed, the flagstone path that Michael had releveled 2 seasons ago, pulling each stone and resetting the base so the path would stay even through the winter freeze-thaw cycles. As William paced, his dress shoe came down in the soft soil beside the path where Michael was working, leaving a deep impression in the carefully cultivated bed. "Excuse me," Michael said quietly. "If you could stay on the path. That bed is freshly amended. It took some time to balance the drainage there." William paused his call. He looked down at his shoe in the soil, then looked at Michael with an expression that shifted from irritation to something sharper. "I'll walk where I like on my own property," he said. "That's what I pay for, to have things maintained." He said the word maintained the way a person says a word they want to land like a verdict. Michael held the man's gaze for one beat. Just one. Steady and clear and entirely without aggression. Then he nodded once and looked back at his work. He had not flinched. He had not argued. But something in that single, steady beat of eye contact clearly unsettled William Calloway in a way the man could not quite name. And that unnamed thing made him angrier than the words had. "The problem with people who do this kind of work," William said, to no one in particular, to both of his associates, to the morning air itself, "is that they get ideas about their place." He stepped back onto the flagstone path and straightened his jacket. "Avery, was it? Your daughter? She goes to Maplewood Elementary?" He had seen the child once, months ago, on a Saturday when Michael had briefly brought her along while he did a quick property assessment after a storm. "Sweet kid. Shame she's being raised to think that this," he gestured broadly, "encompassing everything, is all there is." The words were precise. They were meant to find the thing that mattered most to Michael and push on it. A man who will not flinch for himself will sometimes flinch for his child. William knew that the way predators know where the soft places are. Michael's hands went still on the rose cane he was holding, a long, careful stillness, the kind that takes more discipline to maintain than any outburst. His jaw set, His eyes did not lift from the soil. The two associates stood in the morning air and were very quiet. The way people go quiet when they sense something is happening that they do not entirely understand. He did not answer. William waited a moment, then turned and walked with his associates toward the main house, already back on his phone, the incident already filed away under the category of things that did not require further thought. Michael remained kneeling in the soil, his jaw was set, his eyes were calm, his hands, after a moment, resumed their work with the same precision they had always carried. He finished the rose bed. He moved to the next section. He did not rush. He did not break anything. He did not say a word to anyone about what had just happened. But as he worked, his mind went somewhere that it had not gone in a long time. Back to a conference room in Zurich. Back to a rendering on a screen 40 feet wide, and an auditorium full of engineers and city planners watching with the particular silence of people who have just seen something extraordinary. Back to a younger version of himself who had once stood at the front of that room and spoken for 90 minutes without a single note. Because he had carried the entire design inside him, the way a composer carries a symphony, complete, precise, alive in every detail. He let that memory come, and he let it go, and he went back to the work in front of him. There was a plaque in his truck's glove box. He never showed it to anyone. It was from the International Landscape Architecture Forum, dated 11 years ago. It had his name on it in small, precise letters above the words, Award for Excellence in Environmental Design. He had won it when he was 22 years old, the youngest recipient in the award's history. The plaque had lived in the glove box for 4 years now, under an owner's manual and a box of Avery's crayons. He never thought about it, or he tried not to. Mostly, he succeeded. But that afternoon, when he returned to his truck after 9 hours of work and sat for a moment before starting the engine, he opened the glove box. He did not take the plaque out. He just looked at it, his name, and those words, half hidden under a crayon box. Then he closed the glove box, started the truck, and drove toward Maplewood Elementary to pick up his daughter. He did not know that Aubrey Calloway had been watching from the second-floor window the entire time, and that what she had seen on her husband's face and then on the gardener's had dislodged something deep inside her that she had spent 3 years trying to keep perfectly still. Tuesday mornings belonged to the Calloway property, and Saturday mornings belonged to Avery. That was the division Michael had drawn and held to with the quiet religious devotion of a man who has organized his survival around a small number of non-negotiable anchors. On Saturdays he did not work. He did not check his phone for service messages. He did not let himself think about outstanding invoices or the fact that his truck needed front brake pads, and he was 3 weeks past due on getting them changed. Saturday mornings were Avery's, and that was that, the way a law is a law. Not debated. Not negotiated, simply true. This particular Saturday had started the way the good ones always did, with Avery appearing in his bedroom doorway at 6:47 in the morning, already dressed, her dark hair in the 2 uneven pigtails she had recently learned to do herself. An achievement she was enormously proud of and that Michael praised extravagantly, despite the fact that one pigtail was always slightly higher than the other. A structural irregularity that he found privately magnificent. She was wearing the yellow sunflower shirt and her rain boots, because the weather app had said 30% chance of rain, and she had interpreted that as a certainty requiring proper equipment. "Daddy," she said, standing in the doorway with the tone of someone announcing the start of official business. "It's morning." "I know, Bug. It's Saturday morning." "I'm aware." "So." She folded her small arms with a decisive energy that he recognized as entirely Elena. "Pancakes and then the creek. And then can we go to the plant store? I want to see if the tiny cactus is still there." Michael looked at her from the pillow. The morning light was gray and soft behind her, and she was standing in it like she owned it. She was 7 years old, and she occupied rooms as though they had been built for her arrival. He did not know where she had gotten that quality. Elena had had it too, that particular kind of easy authority. He himself had never quite possessed it, or if he had, it had gone quiet in him somewhere along the way. But he recognized it in Avery, and watching it operate was one of the cleaner pleasures remaining to him. "Pancakes," he said, "and then the creek, and then maybe the plant store if we have time. The cactus might be gone by then." The cactus has been there for 4 Saturdays, Avery. That's because nobody has bought it yet, which means it needs us. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the patient confidence of someone who knows she has already won. The logic was, as far as he could tell, ironclad. He got out of bed. They made pancakes together the way they always did, with Avery standing on the step stool at the counter, in charge of pouring the measured batter, while Michael managed the heat on the skillet. The apartment was small, 900 square feet on the 3rd floor of a building that had last been updated sometime in the mid-90s. But Michael had made it feel intentional. He had painted the living room a deep sage green that he'd mixed himself, a color he'd chosen after long consideration, because it made the evening light feel warm in a particular way that mattered to him. He had built shelves along the kitchen wall from reclaimed lumber and filled them with plants. A Boston fern that had been with them since before Avery could walk. 2 pothos that had propagated themselves into an empire of trailing green, and a small lemon tree that actually produced lemons, a fact that Avery considered only marginally less miraculous than a magic trick. "Dad," Avery said, watching a bubble form and pop in the batter, the signal they had established together for flipping time. "Can plants hear music?" "Some research suggests they respond to sound vibrations," Michael said, handing her the spatula. "Whether that's the same as hearing is a different question." "I sang to the fern last night," she said, flipping the pancake with the focused expression of someone performing a medical procedure. It seemed like it liked it. "What did you sing?" "The dinosaur song from school, but slower, like a lullaby." She glanced up at him with a flicker of uncertainty. "Is that okay?" "I think that's perfect," Michael said. And he meant it without reservation, without qualification, with the complete simplicity of a man who has decided that some things in his life are going to be good, and this, his daughter singing lullabies to houseplants on a Saturday morning, is one of them. These were the hours that sustained him. The particular quality of time in a small apartment on a Saturday morning when the whole world outside was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be, and inside there were only pancakes and a 7-year-old who sang to ferns. He knew, not in a self-pitying way but in the clear-eyed way of a man who has done honest accounting of himself, that he was tired in ways that went past the body. 4 years of doing everything alone had accumulated in him the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you notice the riverbed has changed its shape. He was 33 years old and he felt some mornings like a man who had lived 2 lives in rapid succession, and was now standing in the strange territory between them, not sure which direction was forward. He did not say these things out loud. Not to Avery, not to his mother in Phoenix who called every Sunday and asked how he was doing with the slightly braced tone of someone who is not entirely sure they want to know. He said he was fine. He was fine. He went to work. He made lunches. He sewed stuffed animals back together at midnight. He got up before the sun and drove 40 minutes to kneel in other people's gardens. And he was fine. The word had grown large and accommodating over 4 years. The way words do when they have to hold more than their original meaning was designed to carry. The call from Derek came on Tuesday afternoon, while Michael was loading his tools back into the truck after finishing the Callaway property. The sky had turned the flat white of incoming weather, and the air had the particular smell of late autumn, decaying leaves, cold earth, something electrical in the distance. "Hey, heads up," Derek said. "Callaway called the office this morning." Michael finished setting the last edge tool in the truck bed. He kept his voice level. "About? About you. Said there was an issue. He used the word attitude. Said he's not sure the fit is right going forward." Derek paused. And in the pause, Michael heard his manager choosing his words with more care than usual. "I told him you were our best guy on that property. He wasn't interested in hearing it." Michael leaned against the side of the truck. He looked at the iron gate of the estate, the scroll of it against the white sky. He thought about the Cecile Brunner he had treated that morning for aphid pressure. A careful application of neem oil and water at the correct dilution, applied before the beneficial insects were active. He had done it because the plant needed it, because he had noticed it, because he was constitutionally incapable of doing the work any other way than completely. "How much time do I have?" he asked. He wants someone else assigned starting Thursday. 2 days. Michael did the math the way he always did, quickly and practically, without the luxury of sitting with the feeling first. He had 4 other regular accounts, and 2 on rotation. The Callaway property had represented roughly 40% of his weekly hours. He needed to pick up work. He would call the Marigold Gardens complex, which had been asking about aeration services for 3 months. He would check in with the Northside Community Garden about the paid coordinator position they had mentioned. He would look at the weekend schedule and see what could be moved. He would figure it out. He had always figured it out, and he would figure it out again, because there was a 7-year-old who needed new shoes before the end of the month, and a cactus that needed a home. "Got it," he said. "Thanks for the call, Derek." "I'm sorry, man, it's not right." "No," Michael agreed quietly. "It isn't." Then he ended the call, put his phone in his pocket, and stood for a long moment in the service drive with the sound of wind in the estate's oak alley above him and the distant low murmur of traffic on the road behind the property line. He was not angry. He was something quieter and more durable than anger. He was a man holding the correct accounting of his situation, neither exaggerating it nor minimizing it, letting it be exactly as large as it was. That capacity, the refusal to make his suffering either dramatic or invisible, was one of the things that no one around him ever seemed to fully understand. He did not need to be seen. He just needed to be steady. There was a difference, and it was the most important difference in his life. He thought about the notebook in the truck cab. Page 43. He had been quietly developing a plan for the Callaway property's north slope, a design he had conceived over months of working there. A detailed proposal for transforming what was currently a flat and underutilized section of lawn into a tiered bioswale garden that would manage the estate's chronic drainage problems using native plantings that would reduce maintenance costs by an estimated 40% while dramatically increasing ecological value and visual interest. He had sketched it in the notebook's margins between daily log entries, the way he had always done his best thinking. In the small spaces, without ceremony, not because anyone had asked, but because he could not look at a piece of land without seeing what it could become. That was the nature he had been born with. The one that had been recognized and rewarded in Zurich and Vienna and Berlin, and had then gone underground in Maplewood, Illinois, without ceremony or acknowledgement, because his daughter needed dinner, and the faucet needed fixing, and the work in front of him was what the work in front of him was. He opened the truck cab and sat with the notebook in his hands for a moment. He looked at page 43. The plan was good. It was more than good. A part of him that he rarely allowed an audience recognized it as the best work he had done in years, proof that whatever had been buried in him had not died. Only gone quiet, the way seeds go quiet in winter and wait for a signal that the ground is ready. He closed the notebook, set it under the dashboard, and drove home to make Avery's dinner. What he did not know was that the notebook would be seen, not by the man who had dismissed him, but by the woman who had quietly begun to look at everything differently since the morning she had stood at the second-floor window and recognized, in a stranger's deliberate silence, something she had been missing in herself for a very long time. Aubrey Callaway had built her company the way certain women build things, carefully, without permission, in the spaces that men left unguarded, because they were too busy congratulating each other to notice the territory was changing. Harmon Environmental Group had started as a 2-person consulting firm, specializing in sustainable land development, when Aubrey was 26, operating out of the second bedroom of a rented house in Oak Park, with a laptop, a filing cabinet, and the particular determination of someone who has been told repeatedly that the thing they are building does not belong to them. By the time she was 37, it had 41 employees and annual revenues that placed it in the top tier of regional environmental consulting firms in the Midwest. She had built it with precision, with discipline, and with the kind of endurance that only comes from having been tested all the way down to the thing you are made of, and having found it sufficient. She was good at what she did. She was one of the best in her field, and she knew it the way you know something you had to earn, not arrogantly, but with the steady, unperformative confidence of a woman who has never confused the validation of others with the quality of her own work. She had expected this quality in the man she married. She had believed in the early years that William Callaway possessed it too. A younger, hungrier version of him had seemed to share her architecture, her conviction that how you treated the people below you was the final measure of your character. She had been wrong. The wrongness had revealed itself slowly. The way structural damage reveals itself, in small signs one at a time, each individually dismissible, accumulating over years until the morning she stood at the second-floor window and watched her husband deliberately step into a man's carefully cultivated garden bed and tell him, with refined cruelty, that his daughter was being raised to think this was all there was. That morning had crossed something in her that could not be uncrossed. She had not gone down to the garden. Not that day. She had stood at the window and watched Michael Harmon return to his work, and something in how he worked had kept her there far longer than she intended. It was not the efficiency of it or the pace, though both were evident. It was the quality of his attention, the way he examined each plant with genuine focus, making small decisions one after another guided by something deeper than habit. She recognized that quality. She spent her professional life looking for it, cultivating it in the people she hired, and paying a premium for it when she found it. She did not expect to encounter it here, in this form, and the unexpectedness of it opened a question in her that she could not close. She pulled his employment profile from the Verdana Landscaping Crew Directory. Basic information, started 14 months ago, assigned to 7 properties, no photograph. She ran a search. Michael Harmon, landscape, Maplewood, nothing significant. She added Chicago to the query, still nothing that matched. Then, following an instinct she couldn't fully articulate, the instinct of a professional who has learned to trust her own pattern recognition, she added the words environmental design. The 4th result stopped her breath. It was a cached page from an architectural journal 11 years old, an article about that year's International Landscape Architecture Forum Awards. The headline was clean and unambiguous. Youngest recipient in forum history takes top honor for environmental design. Below it, a photograph of a 22-year-old standing at a podium in a large conference hall in Zurich. He was wearing a dark suit that did not quite fit the way expensive suits fit. The suit of a young man who has not yet had occasion to own many expensive things but will, and he was smiling with a slightly stunned, careful smile of someone receiving confirmation of something they have worked toward their entire life. He was unmistakably the man who had been kneeling in her rosebed 4 days ago. Aubrey read the article twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her home office for a long time, in the particular silence of a person recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a situation. Michael Harmon had not always been a gardener in Maplewood. He had been, before whatever had happened to reduce him to this, one of the most promising environmental design minds of his generation. The article quoted a senior Swiss architect describing his award-winning project. A watershed restoration design for a rural Austrian municipality that integrated sustainable agriculture, flood management, and community green space in a way the reviewer called the kind of thinking that makes you reconsider what landscape architecture is capable of. He had gone on, the article noted, to join a prominent firm in Chicago, where he was expected to continue work on several international commissions. His name, at 22, was being spoken in the same breath as practitioners 20 years his senior. She went looking for what came after. It took longer, and what she found was told mostly in absence, in the sudden disappearance of his name from the professional record after a specific point in time. The firm's quiet notation that he was no longer with the organization, one brief death notice from the Chicago Tribune for Elena Harmon, née Vasquez, 31 years old, survived by her husband Michael and their daughter Avery, age 3, killed in a traffic accident on a Thursday evening in November. The same November, Aubrey calculated, after which his name never appeared again in any professional context. Aubrey closed her laptop. She sat with what she had found the way you sit with something heavy, carefully, giving it full weight, not looking for a way to make it lighter than it was. A man had lost the center of his life. He had gathered everything he was, the talent, the training, the recognition, the international career that was still ascending, and he had put it down, quietly and without announcement, because his 3-year-old daughter needed him present in a way that the life he had built could not accommodate. And then he had gone to work in other people's gardens, and he had done that work with the same quality of attention he had once brought to projects presented before auditoriums in Zurich and Vienna, not because anyone recognized it or rewarded him for it, but because that was the shape of who he was, because his standards were not contingent on the audience. Because integrity for some men is not a performance but a structure, the actual architecture of the self, the thing that holds everything else up even when no one is watching. The confrontation with William happened the following morning at breakfast. It had been building for longer than the incident in the garden. The garden had simply provided the specific form that a formless pressure finally took. Aubrey had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had made coffee and sat with it in the kitchen and looked at the garden through the window while the estate's security lights made pale rectangles on the lawn. She had thought about the notebook she had seen Michael set carefully under his truck's dashboard, the afternoon Derek had called him with the news. She had been in the driveway at that moment, returning from a meeting, and she had watched through the windshield of her own car as he sat in the truck cab with the notebook in his hands. She had seen his face. She had recognized the expression, the look of a person touching something they have put away because they could not afford to let it take up too much room. She knew that expression. She had worn it herself in the first years of building her company, when every month brought a new form of the suggestion that she scale back her ambitions to something more proportionate to what the world expected from someone like her. She had refused. She had the luxury of refusing. She had not been carrying a child alone, had not been running on the margin of grief and financial pressure that defined Michael Harmon's daily existence. She had simply been underestimated by people with institutional power, which was a different and lesser burden, and even that had cost her more than she liked to admit. "William," she said when he came downstairs and poured his coffee, with the unhurried ease of a man who has never had to calculate whether he has time for a second cup. "I want to talk about Michael Harmon." William turned from the counter. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not guilt exactly, more like mild irritation at the introduction of a topic he considered already resolved. "I called the service," he said. "It's handled. They're sending someone new Thursday." "I know," Aubrey said. "I want to talk about what happened in the garden." "Nothing happened in the garden. You stepped into his bed when he asked you not to. You told him his daughter was being raised to accept limitations, in front of clients." She kept her voice even. She had learned over years of running meetings and negotiations with men who mistook aggression for authority, that the most effective thing she could do was stay precisely calm. "You know who he is? He's a gardener." "Aubrey, he's Michael Harmon. He won the International Landscape Architecture Forum Award at 22. He had a firm career in Chicago that he left to raise his daughter alone after his wife died." She watched William's face. The irritation had not left, but something had shifted behind it. The particular discomfort of a man who has dismissed someone and is now being asked to account for that dismissal in light of information he did not have. He designed a watershed restoration project in Austria that Swiss architects were quoting at conferences. "He has been on his knees in our garden for 14 months doing work that is significantly beneath his qualification, and you used his daughter as a weapon against him because he asked you not to step on his flowers." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm going to offer him a position," Aubrey said, "at Harmon Environmental Group. I need a senior environmental design lead for the Riverside Development Project. His qualifications exceed anyone else I've considered, and I've been looking for 8 months. William set down his coffee cup. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference, you should know it by now." She picked up her own cup, took a calm sip and looked at her husband over the rim with the clear, measuring eyes of a woman who has made a decision and is no longer seeking anyone's approval for it. "I'm going to call him this morning." William said something. She did not fully hear it. She was already thinking about the notebook, the pages she had not seen, the design she did not know, the mind she was about to ask to stop kneeling in the dirt and come back to the room where it had always belonged. What she did not know yet, what none of them knew, was that Michael Harmon's notebook contained not just a plan for the north slope of the Callaway estate, but the early architecture of something far larger, a design that would, in time, change the shape of what was possible in ways that even Aubrey, with all her clarity and competence, was not yet prepared to imagine. Eve found out about the phone call on a Wednesday, but he had known something was coming since Sunday. That was the thing about men who have learned to read environments the way Michael had. Not just soil and drainage and root pressure, but rooms, atmospheres, the subtle shift in how people looked at you, or did not look at you, when a narrative about you had already circulated and settled. He had felt it at the Verdana office when he stopped in Monday morning to pick up supplies. Derek had been slightly too careful in his eye contact. The office manager had been slightly too busy. These were small things, individually meaningless, but Michael had spent 4 years becoming an expert in the information carried by small things, and he understood what they were telling him before Derek's call confirmed it on Tuesday afternoon. The night after the call, after Avery was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet, Michael sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold in front of him and did what he rarely allowed himself to do. He let the full weight of it land. Not the job loss specifically. He had managed losses larger than this. But the particular quality of this one. The fact that he had done everything right. The fact that he had treated the property with a level of care it had not received before him and would not receive after him. The fact that the Cecile Brunner, which had been in declining health when he first arrived at the estate, was now thriving, its canes strong, its blooms full, its root system stabilized by amendments he had researched and applied with the patience of someone who understood that certain kinds of growth cannot be rushed. He had done all of that, and a man had stepped on his work and used his daughter's name as a dismissal. And the world had made no note of the difference between what Michael had built and what William Calloway had destroyed in the space of 5 minutes on a Tuesday morning. He was not surprised. That was the part that cost the most. Not the injustice, but the absence of surprise. He had been surprised by things in his life. He had been surprised by Elena, by the way she had looked at him across a seminar room in his second year of graduate school, like she was recognizing something she'd been looking for and had nearly stopped expecting to find. He had been surprised by the award in Zurich, though less than people assumed. He had known the work was extraordinary because he had been close enough to it to feel where it was extraordinary. And awards are only surprising when you have not been paying attention to your own work. He had been surprised by grief, by its specific texture, by the fact that it was not the howling thing he had braced for, but instead something quieter and more persistent. A low-frequency hum beneath everything that changed the color of ordinary moments without always naming itself. But the particular brand of casual diminishment that William Calloway represented, that Michael had encountered before. In boardrooms, in early career moments when his ideas were absorbed without credit, in the specific silence of rooms where competence in a person of a certain background or economic position is treated as a pleasant surprise rather than an expectation. He had learned to carry it the way he carried the grief, by not giving it more room than it required, by returning, always, to the work. The work was the one place where what he actually was could not be disputed, because the evidence was literal and growing and alive and could be seen by anyone willing to look clearly at it. Thursday morning he was at the Marigold Gardens complex by 6:30, assessing the lawn sections he had agreed to take on for the aeration contract. The complex was a residential community of about 400 units, the kind of development that had been built quickly 20 years ago and had been slowly degrading ever since. Not dramatically, but in the incremental way of things that receive competent care, but not intelligent care. The turf was thin in the high-traffic areas. The ornamental beds had been planted without regard for mature sizing, and were now a competition of crowded shrubs, all losing. The drainage from the parking structures was cutting invisible channels through the soil under the east lawn, and in 5 years, if nothing was done, there would be sinkholes. Michael walked the property with the kind of seeing he could not turn off, the trained environmental eye that cataloged, assessed, and immediately began constructing solutions. He took notes. He filled 4 pages of the notebook in 40 minutes. He noted the drainage problem and sketched a rough remediation approach that would cost a fraction of what deferred repair would eventually require. He noted the ornamental bed competition and outlined a 3-season replanting plan using layered native species that would reduce maintenance labor by at least 1/3, while creating visual interest that the current beds entirely lacked. He noted the turf degeneration and identified its causes with the specificity of a diagnostician. Compaction patterns suggesting foot traffic routing, soil chemistry issues visible in the color banding of the grass, irrigation inefficiency evident in the dry shadow zones that persisted even after rain. He was going to be paid for aeration. He did all of this because he could not help it. He had always been this way. Even as a child in his grandmother's yard in South Memphis, a narrow rectangle of land between a chain-link fence and a concrete stoop. He had been the one who noticed that the tomatoes on the left side of the bed were stunted because the downspout runoff was pooling there and compacting the soil, and who had redirected the downspout with a piece of flexible pipe and a handful of gravel, so the water spread evenly, and who had watched with a satisfaction he could not fully name as the left side tomatoes caught up with the right side ones over the following weeks. His grandmother had called him her little scientist. His mother had called him her little professor. What he had actually been was a person who could not look at a living system in difficulty without needing to understand why, and then do something about it. His phone rang at 9:17, an unknown number, Chicago area code. He let it go to voicemail while he finished a measurement. Then he stood at the edge of the east lawn with the morning coming up cold and pale around him, and listened to the message. The voice was businesslike and composed in the way of someone who has conducted many professional calls and has learned to leave no unnecessary space in them. She introduced herself, stated her company, and then said, "I'd like to speak with you about a senior design position at Harmon Environmental Group. I'm familiar with your Forum Award and your pre-Chicago work. I believe you may be the right person for a project we've been trying to staff for 8 months. If you're open to a conversation, please call me back. My name is Aubrey Calloway." Michael stood very still in the cold morning air. The name landed the way a well-placed word lands, precisely, with impact, in the exact space it was aimed at. He played the message again. Then he looked out at the east lawn, at the drainage channels invisible to anyone who had not learned to read the particular way dry grass lies in a wet season. And he breathed slowly and deliberately and felt something shift in him that he had not felt shift in a long time. He did not call back immediately. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to his assessment and filled 2 more pages in the notebook and did the work in front of him with the same complete attention he always brought to it. He let the message sit the way you let a serious offer sit, not out of indifference but out of respect for its weight. He called her back at noon, sitting in his truck with a thermos of coffee and the notebook open on the seat beside him. The call lasted 11 minutes. She was direct and specific and did not waste words. She told him about the Riverside Development Project, a large mixed-use sustainable community on the South Bank that needed an environmental design lead with the capacity to integrate watershed management, ecological planning, and public green space into a cohesive framework that would also satisfy a complex regulatory environment. She told him what she was paying. The number was more than 3 times his annual income at Verdana. He asked her 2 questions. The first was about the project's actual environmental constraints, the specific drainage challenges, the soil composition reports, whether any preliminary ecological assessments had been done. She answered each one with the precision of someone who had done the reading and was not performing competence, but actually possessing it. His respect for her, already forming from the way she had conducted the call, solidified. The second question was, "Your husband is William Calloway." A brief silence. Brief. "Yes," she said. "Does he know you're making this call?" "He knows," she said. "My hiring decisions are mine. They have always been mine." Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can meet Friday morning." What he did not say, what he held carefully in the space between the words, was that he had opened the notebook to page 43 while she was talking, and that the design he had sketched in the margins of someone else's property looked, in the morning light coming through the truck windshield, less like a private exercise and more like a beginning. The offices of Harmon Environmental Group occupied the 6th floor of a reclaimed industrial building in the Fulton Market District of Chicago, and when Michael stepped out of the elevator on Friday morning, he understood immediately that the woman who had built this place was serious in ways that went beyond credentials. The space had the quality of a workplace where the actual work was the point. Not the appearance of the work, not the signaling of the work, but the work itself. There were no motivational phrases on the walls. There were no recreational amenities positioned to suggest a certain culture. There were long tables covered in project materials, large monitors displaying site maps and regulatory overlays, bookshelves dense with technical references, and people sitting at their desks in the particular focused quiet of professionals who are genuinely engaged with difficult problems. He was early. He was always early. He stood at the reception desk in his best clothes, which were not expensive clothes, but were clean and pressed and chosen with the quiet care of a man who understands the difference between what you have and how you carry it. And he waited. He had Avery's school picture in his wallet, the one from September where she was wearing the yellow sunflower shirt and had the characteristic lopsided pigtails and was grinning with the uncomplicated joy of a child who has not yet learned to compose herself for photographs. He had looked at it that morning before leaving the apartment. The way men who work alone sometimes touch the thing that is most real to them before going into uncertain territory. Aubrey came out herself to get him. She was taller than he had understood from seeing her at a distance on the estate, and she carried herself with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have learned not to spend energy performing confidence, because the actual confidence requires no performance. She shook his hand with a direct, unhesitating grip and looked at him the way a person looks when they are genuinely trying to see, not to confirm what they already think they know. "Thank you for coming in," she said. "Thank you for the call," he said. She led him through the office to a conference room with a long window that looked out over the city's low western rooftops toward the river. She had the Riverside project materials spread on the table, not arranged for presentation but arranged for use, the way materials look when someone has been working with them actively, rather than staging them for a meeting. He noticed this. He noticed most things. She opened the meeting with a directness that he appreciated. "I owe you an apology on behalf of my household. What William said to you in the garden was wrong. It was a specific kind of cruelty that he has refined over years of practice, and I am not going to minimize it or explain it away. I'm sorry it happened." Michael looked at her steadily. He had not expected this. He had expected the professional meeting, the evaluation, the careful avoidance of the personal dimension. The directness of what she had said, its lack of self-protection, its refusal to hedge, opened something in him. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it simply without excess. He did not tell her it was fine, because it had not been fine. He did not tell her it didn't matter because it had mattered. Not in the way that breaks a man, but in the way that marks a day. He simply received the apology for what it was and moved on, because that was the kind of man he was. He had brought the notebook. He had not planned to bring it to this first meeting. Had debated it in the car on the drive up, had nearly left it on the passenger seat when he parked, and then had picked it up at the last moment with the instinct of someone who knows the real conversation will eventually require it. He set it on the table beside the project materials and did not open it yet. Aubrey walked him through the Riverside site. The project was more complex than she had conveyed on the phone, in the way that truly interesting problems are always more complex than their description, the detail unfolding in layers as you approach it. The site was 42 acres on the South River bank, heavily contaminated in its northern quadrant from 50 years of light industrial use, with complex hydrology that had been altered by decades of upstream development, a regulatory environment that required simultaneous satisfaction of 3 different jurisdictional frameworks, and a client, a development consortium, that had ambitious sustainability targets they did not fully understand how to achieve, and were growing impatient about the delay in finding someone who could bridge the gap between their vision and the reality of what the land would and would not support. As she spoke, Michael began to see it. Not as an abstraction, but as an actual place. The specific problems of that specific ground, the shape of the solutions that the problems were already suggesting if you knew how to listen to what a contaminated floodplain tells you about what it needs to become. His mind began moving the way it moved when it was fully engaged with something worthy of it, not linearly but laterally and vertically simultaneously, building the solution architecture the way a composer builds a score, multiple registers operating at once, each informing the others. He opened the notebook. "May I?" he said, turning it toward her and pointing to the plan on page 43, the one he had developed over months of working on the Callaway North Slope, the one that had started as an exercise in seeing and had become something else without his quite deciding it would. This was developed for a different site, he said. But the underlying approach, the bioswale integration, the native species layering, the drainage remediation logic, it's applicable here. Scaled differently, modified for the contamination profile and the regulatory constraints. But the structural thinking is the same. Aubrey looked at the page. She looked at it the way she had looked at the article in the Architectural Journal, with the complete attention of a person who has found something real and is taking its measure without rushing. Then she turned to the next page, and the next. He had never shown anyone the notebook before. He sat across from her and watched her read his private thinking and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was neither grief nor resignation nor the practiced steadiness of a man managing his circumstances. It was something that had no easy name, the particular aliveness of being seen accurately, of having the thing you actually are recognized by someone with the competence to recognize it. How long did this take you? She asked, meaning the design on page 43. About 8 months, he said. In the margins. She looked up from the notebook. In the margins of what? The daily work log, he said. I kept it in the same notebook. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you were designing this while you were working at the property. I was noticing problems while I was working at the property, he said. The design followed from the noticing, it usually does. What came next was not what either of them had planned. Aubrey had prepared a structured interview, questions about methodology, about regulatory experience, about project management approach, about team leadership philosophy. She had a rubric. She had always had a rubric. She had built her company on the discipline of structured evaluation, on the refusal to let chemistry substitute for criteria. She never asked any of the prepared questions. Instead, they talked, for 3 hours, without stopping, without the feeling that time was passing, about the specific technical challenges of the Riverside site, about contamination remediation methodologies and their ecological implications, about the relationship between watershed design and community green space that most developers treated as separate disciplines, and that Michael argued, clearly and specifically and with the technical authority of someone who had studied and practiced at the intersection of both, were not separate at all, but were in fact the same discipline approached from different scales. He drew on the conference room whiteboard. She pushed back on 3 specific points. Hard, well-informed pushback that required him to either hold his position with evidence or revise it, and twice he revised. Once she revised, and the third time they found a third position that neither had started with, and that was better than both. This was the moment, if there was a single moment, that Aubrey Calloway understood the full weight of what had been kneeling in her rosebed for 14 months. Not just a man with credentials, not just an award from a forum in Zurich, but a mind of a specific and rare quality, a mind that had not been diminished by 4 years of working below its capacity, but had been, in some way she would need more time to fully understand, deepened. The suffering had not broken the thinking. If anything, the suffering had removed whatever was not essential and left what was, a clarity of purpose, a groundedness in the real, a patience with complexity that came not from temperament alone, but from having lived at close quarters with things that could not be rushed and could not be forced and required. Above all, the willingness to stay present with difficulty without demanding that it resolve on your schedule. She thought about the fern, the one his daughter had sung to. She did not say this out loud. At 12:40 she said, I want to show you the site. Are you free this afternoon? He pulled out his phone and looked at his calendar. Avery had a half-day. School ended at noon on Fridays. His mother had offered twice in recent weeks to take her after school when Michael had work. He had not taken her up on it, because he was careful about creating dependencies, careful about the particular math of favors, but this was different. This was the kind of different that a man recognizes when it arrives, even if he is cautious about letting himself name it too quickly. I need to make a call, he said. He stepped out of the conference room and called his mother. She answered on the second ring. Can you get Avery this afternoon? He said. I have something I need to finish. His mother paused, not with concern but with the careful attentiveness of a woman who had been watching her son hold himself together for 4 years, and knew the specific weight of what he'd just said. Of course, she said. Michael, is everything all right? He stood in the hallway outside the conference room, with the city's low western light coming through a window at the end of the corridor, with the sound of people working seriously at difficult problems behind the glass wall, with the notebook under his arm and the designs he had drawn in margins for 4 years suddenly in a room with someone who could do something with them. Yeah, he said. And then, quietly, because it was true and because his mother deserved to know it was true, I think it might be. They drove to the Riverside site in Aubrey's car. She drove the way she did everything else. Directly, without fuss, economical. On the way she told him without being asked, without how she had found the journal article. She told him in the same tone she had used to apologize. Straightforward, without self-consciousness, not making it larger or smaller than it was. I ran a search after I saw what William did, she said. I needed to understand who I had been looking at. He was quiet for a moment. What did you think? He said. When you found it? She kept her eyes on the road. I thought about what it costs, she said, to put something down that you built that completely, and then to show up every day and do the work in front of you anyway. She paused. I've had to do smaller versions of that. I know what it takes. Yours wasn't a small version. He looked out the passenger window at the city passing. He thought about Avery asleep with Carrots the one-eyed rabbit. He thought about the lemon tree on the kitchen shelf. He thought about page 43. She was worth it, he said. She's worth everything I've ever done and everything I haven't done. There's no version of the accounting where that's a sacrifice, it's just what it is. What it was always going to be. Aubrey said nothing. She did not need to say anything. They drove the rest of the way to the site in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was, in the way of silences between people who have said something true to each other, actively respectful. When they got out of the car and walked to the edge of the Riverside site, 42 acres of difficult, contaminated, complicated, magnificent land, waiting for someone to see what it could become, Michael stood at the boundary and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he opened the notebook to a fresh page and he began. 3 weeks later, William Calloway would stand in Aubrey's office doorway and look at the name on the lead designer plaque for the Riverside project, the largest environmental commission in the company's history, and understand with the particular clarity of a man confronting the precise measure of his own smallness, exactly what he had been kneeling in front of when he stepped on those roses. The Riverside project broke ground on a Thursday morning in March, 14 weeks after Michael Harmon walked onto that contaminated South Bank site for the first time and stood at its edge with an open notebook and a clarity of vision that he had spent 4 years quietly keeping alive in the margins of other people's properties. The groundbreaking was attended by city officials, the development consortium's partners, Aubrey's staff, journalists from 2 architecture publications and 1 general interest magazine that had picked up the project after the design renderings were released and had called the plans, in a phrase that was shared widely in professional circles, a once-in-a-generation approach to urban ecological design. The lead designer was listed on every program and press release and signboard as Michael Harmon. He stood at the ceremony in a dark coat with his hands clasped in front of him, and his face arranged in the composed, unhurried expression that people who had known him only as the gardener would not have recognized as what it actually was. Not calm, not detachment, but the deep-rooted settledness of a man who was standing in the right place after a long time of not standing there. He did not make a speech. He had been asked to, and he had declined, not out of false modesty, but because what he had to say about this project did not belong in a speech at a groundbreaking ceremony. It belonged in the ground itself, in the design he had drawn and redrawn and refined over 3 months of the most sustained, focused creative work he had done since the project in Zurich. Working late into the nights at the kitchen table after Avery was asleep, the sage-green walls of the apartment holding the lamplight around him like something intentional. Avery was there. She stood beside him in the yellow sunflower shirt. She had insisted, had explained with considerable seriousness that it was her lucky shirt, and that lucky shirt days were not limited to school. And she held his hand during the speeches with the easy, unself-conscious grip of a child who does not yet know that holding your father's hand in public is supposed to become complicated. She looked around at the site with wide eyes, at the stakes and the flags and the equipment at rest along the edges, and then she looked up at him with the question that had been forming in her for the drive over. "Daddy," she said, during a pause in the remarks, "is this yours?" He looked down at her. The question was more precise than she knew. "It will be," he said quietly. "When it's finished, it will be something that came from me. That's not quite the same as being mine, but it's close enough." She considered this with the focused expression she brought to things she was genuinely trying to understand. Then she nodded, satisfied, and turned back to watch the ceremony with the attentive gravity of someone attending to official proceedings. The months that followed were the hardest work of his professional life, and the most complete. The Riverside site was everything the preliminary assessments had suggested. Complex, uncooperative in the specific ways that contaminated urban land is uncooperative, resistant at every turn, to the clean solutions that looked good on paper and broke down on contact with reality. There were setbacks. The northern quadrant contamination was deeper than the initial soil surveys had indicated, requiring a remediation approach that added 6 weeks to the schedule and forced a redesign of the watershed integration system that Michael had considered the project's structural heart. He redesigned it in 4 days. The new version, his team agreed, was better than the original. He had a team. This was new. He had spent 4 years working alone, and the adjustment to leading a group of 8 professionals, landscape architects, environmental engineers, an ecologist named Dr. Patricia Vance, who had forgotten more about riparian systems than most people ever learned, required from him a kind of expansion he had not entirely anticipated. Not of his technical capacity, which had never diminished, but of the part of himself that knew how to occupy a room with authority. That part had gone quiet during the Maplewood years. It came back with the tentative, slightly startled quality of a thing returning to itself, uncertain at first of its footing, then increasingly steady, then by month 3 entirely at home. Patricia Vance told him after a particularly difficult technical review meeting in which he had navigated competing methodological approaches from 3 engineers who each believed they were correct. "You know you're the most patient person I've ever worked with. And somehow that makes you the most effective person I've ever worked with. I've been trying to figure out how that works. I spent 4 years working with plants," he said. "They don't respond to pressure. They respond to conditions. Create the right conditions and then get out of the way." She looked at him. "You know you're talking about people, not plants." "I know," he said. The conversation with William Calloway happened on a Tuesday evening in April, in the parking structure beneath Harmon Environmental's building, and it was brief and definitive in the way of conversations that have been a long time coming, and therefore require very few words to say everything that needs to be said. William had come to the building, not to speak to Aubrey, who had moved out of the estate in February and was managing the practical complexities of the end of her marriage with the same methodical competence she brought to every other difficult problem, but apparently specifically to speak to Michael, who... He was waiting by the elevator when Michael came down after a late review session, and for a moment the 2 men simply looked at each other in the flat light of the parking structure, and the distance between what they had each been and what they each were now was apparent in the air between them without requiring description. "I heard the renderings got picked up by the architecture press," William said. He was trying for a tone of casual acknowledgement and not quite landing it. "They did," Michael said. A pause. William looked at his hands, then back up. He was a man who had spent his life in the position of authority, and standing in this particular parking structure, with this particular man, he was clearly trying to locate a footing he had not needed to find before. "I was wrong," he said finally. "What I said? About your daughter." Michael was quiet for a moment. He thought about the garden, about the rose bed, about the Cecile Brunner he would not see bloom this spring because he was no longer there to tend it, though he had no doubt it would bloom regardless, because he had set its conditions correctly, and living things, when their conditions are right, do not require the constant presence of the person who established them. They just grow. "Yes," he said. "You were." He did not say it with anger, and he did not say it with performance. He said it the way a man states a fact that he has long since made his peace with, clearly without residue, and without any invitation to revisit it further. William nodded once, then he turned and walked toward his car, and Michael watched him go with the even, unhurried eyes of a man who has settled every account he needed to settle, and is no longer interested in the ones that do not belong to him. The Riverside project was completed in September, 4 months ahead of the revised schedule, a fact that generated its own brief wave of press attention in the environmental design community. The opening was a public event, attended by several hundred people, and what greeted them when they walked into the space was something that is difficult to describe in the vocabulary of project outcomes and design metrics and regulatory compliance. because it exceeded all those categories in the way that genuine things always exceed the categories designed to contain them. It was a place. A real place where the water moved through engineered channels that looked entirely natural, where native plantings in their mature summer growth created a layered visual depth that changed completely with every step and season, where children ran through the public meadow section with the specific, heedless joy of children who have found a place that was made for them, where the contaminated North Quadrant that had been a no-man's land for half a century was now a wetland restoration zone that ecological monitors were already calling one of the most successful urban habitat corridors in the region's recent history. The design had accomplished every technical objective, satisfied every regulatory requirement, and come in under budget. It had also done something that does not appear in project briefs. It had made something beautiful. Not decorative, not aesthetically managed. Beautiful in the particular way of things that are exactly what they need to be, where form and function and meaning have been brought into such precise alignment that you can feel it without being able to say exactly why. Michael stood at the edge of the wetland corridor in the September afternoon light and watched a red-winged blackbird land on a cattail stem and tip it gently with its weight, and he felt the thing he had been working toward without quite naming it for 4 years. The quiet, complete satisfaction of a man who has found his way back to the full expression of what he is, not despite what he lost but through it, the loss having been, in ways he would need years to fully understand, the condition that made this version of the work possible. He had brought Avery. She was wearing the sunflower shirt, now slightly small for her, the hem above her navel and the sleeves above her wrists. But she had refused to retire it for this occasion, and he had not pressed the point. She walked beside him through the meadow section with her eyes very wide and her hand in his, occasionally pointing at things. A particular flower she wanted to identify, a frog on the edge of the wetland, the way the light moved on the water through the cattail stems. She was not performing wonder. She was experiencing it, fully and without self-consciousness, with the complete openness of a child who has been raised by a man who taught her, by example and without explicit instruction, that paying close attention to the world around you is not a passive act but an active one. Not something that happens to you, but something you choose to do, a form of respect for the living systems you share the planet with. "Dad," she said, stopping in the middle of the path and looking up at him with a seriousness that always caught him slightly off guard because it was so entirely genuine. "Did you make all of this?" He crouched down to her level. He looked at her face, the dark eyes, the expression of concentrated inquiry, the lopsided pigtail that was always slightly higher on the left, and he felt the full weight of the last 4 years as clearly and cleanly as he had ever felt it. Not as burden, not as loss, but as the specific substance of which this moment was made. Every early morning, every packed lunch, every sewn-together rabbit ear, every page in every notebook filled in the margins of other people's properties, every day of not breaking when breaking would have been easier. All of it had been the work. All of it had been the design, laid down in the only material that ultimately matters. "I designed it," he said. "A lot of people built it, but the idea, what it was going to be, that came from me." She nodded with the decisive nod of someone filing important information correctly. Then she looked out at the wetland, at the light on the water, at the blackbird still on the cattail stem. "It's like our kitchen," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You made our kitchen good too," she said simply. "With the plants and the shelves and the colors, you make places good." She looked back at him. "That's your thing." He looked at his daughter for a long moment in the September light, in the place he had made out of 42 acres of difficult ground and 4 years of silence, and the kind of love that does not announce itself, but simply shows up, day after day, in the work in front of it. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." He stood up and took her hand, and they walked on through the meadow together, the blackbird lifting from the cattail behind them, the September light warm and level across the living ground, the place becoming more fully itself with every step they took through it. The way good things do, the way all made things do, when they have been designed with the right materials and given enough time and tended by someone who knows that the most important part of the work is simply the willingness to stay. He had stayed. That was everything. He had stayed and knelt in the dirt and written in the margins, and made her lunch and sewn the rabbit's ear and driven before sunrise and absorbed the diminishment without letting it diminish what was real, and kept the plaque in the glove box under the crayons. Not as a reminder of what he had been, but as evidence of what he had never stopped being. And Avery had watched all of it. Not the struggle which he had kept from her as much as a man can keep such things from a child who loves him, but the quality of it, the steadiness, the refusal to be less than himself regardless of what the world offered him in exchange for the convenience of a smaller version. She had watched a man remain himself under pressure that would have unmade most people, and she would carry that watching with her for the rest of her life, in the way children carry the true things they witness, not as a lesson, not as an instruction, but as a picture of what is possible, pressed between the pages of who she was becoming. That was his real work. That had always been his real work. Everything else was just the garden.